Sometimes alone feels really good. That's one of the things that I like about hiking and fishing. When I'm out hiking and fishing, I'm usually alone and unavailable. Just enjoying God's beautiful creation, enjoying what I'm doing out there. And if I am doing it with somebody, let's say fishing with a buddy or hiking with my wife, that's by my choice. Now, that's the good alone for me. But there's another kind of alone that's not so good. In fact, that sometimes maybe seems a little scary, maybe even a lot scary. Alone on the first day at a new school, alone first day on the new job, alone your parents dropping you off at college for the first time, alone at a dark, stormy night, alone as you're going into surgery, alone when you're deployed or your loved one's deployed, alone when you're struggling at school and can't really seem to make things come out right, and no matter what you do, alone when you're caring for a family member, alone when you're transitioning to a totally new place or totally new situation. That kind of alone doesn't usually feel good, not for long, especially when you're alone and things aren't going very well for you. I mean, and your worldview's kind of turned upside down, and you might even feel that God's not around, or if He is, He sure seems really, really hard to find. You might even wonder if God's left you to deal with all this challenging stuff all by yourself. Alone and afraid. Which is where I think Joseph is when we turn to this next scene in his story. I mean, when Joseph was on top of the world, when it looked like he was going to be the next boss of the family, even though he was son number 11, and get the bulk of inheritance, when Dad passed on, it seemed fairly obvious to him that God was around, and that God was working, and that God was working things out for good for him. I mean, when you're successful and things are going pretty much the way you want them to, that's how you feel. It's easy to feel that way. But when things fall apart, sometimes it sure feels like God's not around and you're there all by yourself, doesn't it? Which is where I kind of think Joseph is when this story takes a turn for the worse. And you know what? Even before then, Joseph had some bouts with loneliness. I mean, Joseph was part of a big family. He had 11 brothers, but he'd been getting the cold shoulder from most of them for a while. And so I think that even though he had all those brothers and at least one sister, that Joseph sometimes felt pretty alone in the crowd. Cold shoulders have a way of doing that to you, don't they? And maybe some of you have been there too. Ignored by others, surrounded by people, but nobody giving you the time of day unless they're making your day miserable. That's no good, is it? And it's even worse, I think, unfortunately, here, because Joseph may have brought some of that on himself with his kind of foolish pride that he has as a young kid. And this is a really important but. Even when we're getting it wrong, like Joseph was here, God doesn't abandon us, and God doesn't forsake us. God doesn't leave us alone. God doesn't go back on His promises. Even when life gets so challenging that it's hard for us to see God anywhere in the vicinity. Good thing that's true. That it always has been and that always will be, because Joseph was about to discover what alone was really like when what we call those challenges of life were going to hit him full force. I mean, here's what happened. Dad sent him out to check on his brothers and see what they were doing and if they were doing the right thing. And they see him coming out there in the wilderness all alone, far, far from home, in the protection of dear old Dad. And they see their chance. All right, first they plotted to kill him, and then they decided on, well, maybe the more indirect method. Now, let me read that to you. Genesis 37, verse 23. So Joseph reached his brothers. They stripped him of his special robe with the long sleeves. Then they took him and put him into an empty cistern. It had no water in it. Now the cistern was made for storing water. It's like this deep hole that was carved into the rock, into the bottom, and it was kind of shaped like a little bottle, so had a kind of a small little opening at top and then got bigger at the bottom, and then they'd cover it with kind of a lime-like plaster to waterproof it. So there's no real handholds. It's a little slippery, and they beat him and throw him down there, and what chance is there of escape? Minimal, right? He's not going to be able to climb up, and if his brothers are there and sticking a rock over, how's he going to get out? And what are his chances of survival? I mean, slim and none. There's no food or water down there, and he can't climb up, and so he's beaten up and thrown down there by his brothers, and the symbol of his special standing, that robe, is ripped from him, and he's far, far away from home without any hope of rescue, all alone, right? Or so it seemed. Dark down there in the bottom of that pit, alone with his thoughts, probably figuring he's got little or no chance of surviving this. Maybe even wondering, when all that's going on in that deep, dark pit, well, where is God? Where is God now? I mean, he was the golden boy. Why is this happening to him? Been there yourself? When things that have been going so right suddenly start going so wrong? And you get hurt from people or places that you never expected? I mean, and you feel so vulnerable, so helpless, so isolated, so alone. And you wonder if you're ever going to get out of that pit, or if this God you believed in knows you're there. Well, he does, you know. God knows you're there, and God is with you even when you're alone and afraid in the deep, dark pit. He's there. Sometimes it's just hard to see it.
We've all been there before, weighed down by life, stressed, stuck. Life has a way of placing burdens on our backs and fear in our hearts. Sometimes it's difficult to see our destination while wandering the depths of the desert. But even in the valleys of life, God is there with us. In our darkest moments, He is a light. In our greatest pain, He is our comfort. In the midst of fear, He is our courage. We serve a God who will never leave us, a Redeemer who will never forsake us, and a Savior who loves us beyond measure. Anywhere, anytime, in any moment, God is with us.
Now, in Joseph's story, there are some hints that that's true. That God, even though He's neither seen nor sensed, is still there. And God's still working. And God's still working to protect and preserve Joseph's life. Hint number one, let's kill him, the brothers said. And it looks like that's what's going to happen, and that would have been the end of Joseph till at the very last moment, Reuben, the oldest brother, steps in and intervenes just in time. Now, do you think maybe God had something to do with that? That God was there working even when Joseph couldn't see it or sense it? Hint number 2. Joseph's brothers then planned to let him rot and die in that cistern. But then this caravan of slave traders happens to come on by, and they sold him instead. And again, Joseph's life is preserved. Now, is the timing of that coincidental, or do you think perhaps God had something to do that? That God was still there working, even when Joseph couldn't see it or sense it, again, protecting and preserving his life, even in the bad things, so he could bring about some good that Joseph couldn't yet see. And Joseph did get out of the pit. But the situation didn't really get any better, except for the fact that he's alive. I mean, the brothers sell him to these passing slave traders for 20 pieces of silver, and they take him far, far away from home to Egypt, and they sell him to Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's guard. And so while Joseph's alive, he is very, very alone. A slave in a foreign land, in a totally different culture, all by himself, no friends, no family, no prospects but being a slave and never hope of seeing home again, alone and not sure what's next. Ever been there? Not sure where you're going or what's coming or what life holds, but pretty sure that whatever lies ahead, like Joseph's probably thinking there, that it's whatever lies ahead is not going to be good. Ever been there? Alone? Alone and afraid? Alone and afraid not just of what is and what you think is coming, but also afraid, again, that God might not even be around in all of that. I mean, I think that's where Joseph probably was or was heading on this road to Egypt. And pretty sure that reading between the lines, the refrain going through his head at this point's probably, poor me, and why me, and why God? Where are you, God? I mean, that's how you think, and that's how you feel when you're alone and afraid. You're alone and hurting, and the prospects aren't good, and you don't see them getting any better, and you don't see how it's going to change or think it's going to change, and you're wondering, where is God in all of this mess? I mean, it's really hard for Joseph to see that on the road to Egypt. Again, family left behind, no prospects of ever coming back, not sure what's ahead except the life of slavery. A hard life and probably a much shorter life, pretty much guaranteed. Pretty hard for Joseph to feel that he's not totally alone, and then to be afraid, except the person who recorded this knows something that it's still going to take Joseph a little while to see. What the person who recorded this knows is that not everything is good, and that not everything we do is good, and sometimes in life things get worse before they get better, but none of that chases God away. None of that chases God away. And even when life leaves us feeling alone, God is still working, and God is still running after us, and God's still working to redeem the situation. Not everything's good, but in everything, God is working. And God is working to bring about the good and that He desires. And God never, ever leaves us to face that aloneness all by ourselves, even if it seems like it. Let's jump ahead in Joseph's story to Genesis 39. Here's what the narrator writes. When Joseph was taken to Egypt by the Ishmaelite traders, he was purchased by Potiphar, an Egyptian officer. Potiphar was captain of the guard for Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. The Lord was with Joseph, so he succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. Potiphar noticed this and realized that the Lord was with Joseph, giving him success in everything he did. This pleased Potiphar, so he soon made Joseph his personal attendant. He put him in charge of his entire household and everything he owned. From the day Joseph was put in charge of his master's household and property, the Lord began to bless Potiphar's household for Joseph's sake. All his household affairs ran smoothly, and his crops and livestock flourished. So, Joseph was alone in Egypt, a slave in a foreign land. But the narrator of the story gives this little insight. Again, verse 2, if you missed it. The Lord was with Joseph. And the point for us to see there is this, that even when you think you're alone, you can trust that God is still with you. And that in everything, God is working. And that God is working for you, and that God is working to flip that bad stuff around so that something good comes out of it in the end. And as we read on in this chapter, you start to think that maybe Joseph is even starting to begin to think that that's possible, that it's actually true. I mean, he's not in a good place, but his fortunes have changed somewhat. He's still a slave, but he's successful. So successful that he ended up managing all of Potiphar's house. Was the Lord with him? Maybe, he thought. Just maybe. And then again, maybe not. Because hard to feel God's with you when you get punished for doing the right thing. When you do what you're supposed to do and you get in trouble for it. When you're unjustly accused and convicted even though you didn't do anything wrong. Because that's what happened next. Again, let's look back in on this story.
So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't worry about a thing except what kind of food to eat. Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man, and Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. "Come and sleep with me," she demanded. But Joseph refused. "Look," he told her, "my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held back nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God." She kept putting pressure on Joseph day after day, but he refused to sleep with her, and he kept out of her way as much as possible. One day, however, no one else was around when he went in to do his work. She came and grabbed him by his cloak, demanding, "Come and sleep with me." Joseph tore himself away, and he left his cloak in her hand as he ran from the house. When she saw that she was holding his cloak and he had fled, she called out to her servants. Soon all the men came running. "Look," she said, "my husband has brought this Hebrew slave here to make fools of us. He came into my room to rape me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream, he ran outside and got away, but he left his cloak behind with me." She kept the cloak with her until her husband came home. Then she told him her story. "That Hebrew slave you brought into our house tried to come in and fool around with me," she said, "but when I screamed, he ran outside, leaving his cloak with me." Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. So he took Joseph and threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained.
So Joseph did nothing wrong and everything right as far as we can see, and he ends up in prison for it? I mean, maybe the first time things turned against him, you could say that Joseph's pride had a part to play in his fall, but here he's just being a person of integrity, which is what God wants us to be. So Joseph is doing what's right, and he ends up in prison. It seems so wrong. Alone again. Alone and afraid, and probably wondering, why God seems to not be around and why God doesn't seem to be working for his good. I mean, if you've ever suffered for doing the right thing, you know what I'm talking about. But again, the narrator knows something that Joseph doesn't see yet. Verse 21, but the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. The Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and over everything that happened in the prison. The warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything. The Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. Now again, this situation is not good. Prison never is. But it's even worse if you're there like Joseph was for something you didn't do wrong. It's pretty easy there to feel alone and abandoned and afraid, and to think that if God was working once, he's certainly not there working for you now, at least not for you. But again, the narrator knows the truth. Again, verse 21, the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him in his faithful love. What he's telling us is that even in all this bad stuff, and it's bad stuff, that God was still working. Right? God was still working to help Joseph get a little sense of his presence. And God was still working to prepare Joseph for what was coming up. And God was working to put Joseph in contact with people who eventually would get him to the place that he needed to be. And maybe as you read the rest of this chapter, you start to think, hey, that just might be true, until you turn the page. Because as so often happens, just like it does with us, you turn the page and life turns again. Right? Pharaoh's taste tester is in prison. And he has this dream, and Joseph tells him that the dream means that he's actually going to get out of prison. He's going to be restored to his position. And then Joseph asks him, when you get back to Pharaoh, please remember me. And the taster says, sure, I will remember you. And it happened just like Joseph said, and he gets out and he gets restored. And then we read this at the close of this chapter. Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, however, forgot all about Joseph, never giving him another thought. And it was 2 more years before he even remembered that Joseph was there. Again, it appears as if Joseph is all alone. Alone and afraid, and afraid that maybe he's been forgotten, not just by the cupbearer, but again by God. But is that true? I mean, here's the real question that this part of the story focuses for us. Can I find God even in places that I don't want to be? Can I find God even in times that I can't know why? Can I find God even when it seems like I'll be stuck in a bad situation maybe forever? Well, the narrator answers that over and over and over again. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. Through everything and in everything, even when Joseph was most alone, the Lord was with Joseph, holding on to him and supporting him and strengthening him and helping him persevere, helping him make it through some really tough stuff, because behind the scenes he was working overtime to that the messes this family had made, that still some good would come out of it that no one ever saw coming. The Lord was with Joseph in those darkest moments and deepest fears, with him in the hurt, with him in the pain, with him in the loneliness, with him in the despair, with him in the rejection, with him in the betrayal, with him in his abandonment, with him when he thought he was going to die, with him when all his dreams went poof, with him when he was without family or friend, with him when he thought he had lost everything, with him when he appeared destined to live out life as a slave, and a slave in prison, far, far, far from home. And you know what? We've got an advantage that Joseph didn't have. See, when we're alone and afraid and in difficult situations and wondering whether God is actually there, we can read God's track record. Joseph's story here is part of that. And we can see that God's story has been remarkably consistent for thousands of years. God's story is that even when you think you're alone, you can trust that God's with you. And that in everything God is working. And that God is working for you. And that God is working to flip that bad around so that something good can come out of it in the end. And you know what else we know when we dig into that story? We see that we have a God who actually understands what those lonely places are like. Because he went there himself. I mean, look at Jesus' story. And what you'll find is that Jesus went to all those same sort of lonely places, didn't he? I mean, there are some remarkable parallels between that and the Joseph story. Turned on by those closest to him. There's a point in John 6 where Jesus speaks and a whole bunch of people who had been following him just turned away because what he said was too hard for them. And he turns to his disciples, the 12 closest, and he says, "Are you guys going to leave too?" And then there's that moment on the cross. My God, why have even you forsaken me?" Jesus knows alone. How about a journey where you're bound and led to others, to places you'd rather not go? Think of Jesus being bound and led to the cross. How about wrongly accused? Well, read through Jesus' trials. How about forgotten and abandoned? Well, betrayed by one friend, denied by another, all of them ran away. How about in this big, dark, deep pit where it seems like there's no way out? Well, after the cross, Jesus was laid in a tomb, and a big stone rolled in front, dead and buried. It doesn't get any deeper or darker than that. Those are all scary and lonely places to be. Scary places to be alone, which is why Jesus went there on purpose. See, Jesus went there on purpose so that when you're alone in the darkness and you feel all alone and you're afraid, even though the darkness and despair, even through that darkness and despair, you can hear this little whisper. I'm still with you. I'm still with you. I'm still with you. And even though that little whisper might not be all that you want right then, it's that little whisper's enough. It's enough for you to know, even when you feel afraid, that like Joseph, that you can still trust that God is there. Just like he said he would be. Psalm 23. Even in the deepest, darkest valleys, I will not fear, for you are with me. Hebrews 13, verse 5, I will never leave you or forsake you. Matthew 28, lo, I am with you always, even to the very end of the age. And that gives us hope. When we think we're alone, we can still trust that Jesus is there too. And then we can hang on until we see it. I like how Psalm 56 puts it. Even when I'm afraid, I will still trust in you.